Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ben here, and today I am back again with another video. The subject of today's video is going to be on Anthony Davis. If you haven't heard the news, this morning at around 8 a.m., Anthony Davis told the Pelicans that he will not be signing an extension with them when they offer it this summer, and that he has requested a trade and wants to be out of New Orleans. That being said, today I am going to be presenting some updated Anthony Davis trade scenarios. I had a video, I think a month or two back, about Anthony Davis trade scenarios, but considering the news that we just got today, I have a new video with Anthony Davis trade scenarios. For this video, I tried to stick to teams that I only considered contenders. That being said, so like the West, I basically could use anybody, but I didn't include Memphis. Obviously, I didn't include New Orleans, and then I didn't include Phoenix because none of those three are really contenders. But honestly, everybody else is basically a contender. And in the East, I didn't include anybody who is outside of like the top five, which is Toronto, Milwaukee, Indiana, Philadelphia, and Boston. So like that's just a little piece of information there. So you won't see anything like Anthony Davis to Charlotte or Anthony Davis to New York or anything like that. I only have him going to contenders in these scenarios just because I feel like those are the ones that would actually matter and be relevant. Whereas if you have a trade where it's like, oh, Anthony Davis going to the Heat, like that's not really going to impact them that much, I don't think, or it's like unlikely to happen. So for those reasons, I didn't include trade scenarios like that. That being said, I did order these such in a way that I kind of did like the least contenders at the beginning to the biggest contenders at the end. So if at the beginning you're thinking like, oh, why do you have like Dallas in there as a big contender? It's not that necessarily. I don't think they're a big contender. I think they are a contender. I put the lesser contenders towards the front of the list. That being said, let's get into it. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do is read off Anthony Davis's stats, just so we're all familiar with where he's at. Uh, so he's basically a top, I think, depending on where you see him, you could say he's a top three player in the NBA, top five. I'd say right in between there. Like people have certain preferences with how you rank them, but like uh, I'd say it's like LeBron, Giannis, Anthony Davis, James Harden. Those are sort of like the top four players in the league right now, I guess I'd say. It's hard to rank them in whichever order, it kind of depends. I don't really have a specific ranking, but here we go with Anthony Davis's stats. So for his career, he's averaging 24 points a game, 11 rebounds a game, 2 assists, 1 steal, 2 blocks, shooting 52% from the field and 31% from three, and 80% from the line. Now, this season specifically, 2018 to 19, he's averaging 29 points a game, 13 rebounds a game, both career highs, 4 assists a game, which is also a career high, 2 steals a game, also a career high, nearly 3 blocks a game, and he is shooting 51% from the field, 32.5% from 3-point land, and he's shooting 81% from the line. So really solid numbers, obviously superstar numbers, and any team would want this guy. So let's get into some of these trade scenarios. So the first one I have is between Dallas and New Orleans. I have Dallas getting Anthony Davis and Drew Holiday, and I have New Orleans getting DeAndre Jordan, Wes Matthews, and Dennis Smith Jr., along with two future first round picks. So New Orleans, basically, because DeAndre Jordan and Wes Matthews both have expiring contracts, this is essentially giving New Orleans two future first round picks, Dennis Smith Jr., and $40 million in cash because of the expiring contracts. So this is sort of like an ultimate, like New Orleans trying to rebuild. They don't think it's worth it to keep either of their two guys that have big contracts. Well, AD they kind of have to trade, and then Drew Holiday they're like, we don't really want him if we're trying to rebuild. In that case, you look at their roster and they have those 40 million between Wes Matthews and DeAndre Jordan, which will be coming off the books. Solomon Hill and Nikola Mirotic both coming off the books after this season, which adds up to another 24 million. So combined, you have 64 million coming off the books there. Then Wes Johnson is also coming off the books, so that's adds up to $70 million off the books. So you'd have a ton of cap space to play with, and then you get Dennis Smith Jr. and 2 future first round picks. So this is the ultimate like we're gonna rebuild trade. As for Dallas, you get Drew Holiday and AD both in their primes, and you can pair them with let's see here. Your starting lineup could look something like Drew Holiday, Luka Doncic, Harrison Barnes, probably like Dwight Powell, and then Anthony Davis. That's a pretty solid starting lineup, and I think could definitely make the playoffs next year. Also, maybe if Dallas didn't want to get the expiring contract in Wesley Matthews or DeAndre Jordan, they could also swap out Harrison Barnes for either of these two guys. If they want to try and contend a little bit more, you'd probably put in Harrison Barnes in place of Wes Matthews. But I just feel like if they were going to take this trade, it'd be like the ultimate. We're going to restart, get cash and a young promising guy in Dennis Smith and draft picks. All right, moving on. The next trade I have on here is between Pelicans and the Minnesota Timberwolves. I have the Timberwolves getting Anthony Davis, Solomon Hill, and Wes Johnson. The last two guys are really just throw-in picks to make salary match. And then on the other side, I have the Pelicans getting Andrew Wiggins, Taj Gibson, and Derrick Rose. This is, and also 2 first-round picks in the future, probably 2019 and 2021. So for New Orleans, this is like the option of we're still trying to contend, and this is like a package that they could get back. So you're essentially Solomon Hill and Wes Johnson don't really play or aren't really that effective either way. So it's essentially Anthony Davis in exchange for Wiggins, Gibson, and Derrick Rose. Derrick Rose and Gibson are on expiring deals. Derrick Rose is only making $1.5 million this year, so he's a really nice like throw-in to any trade package. After this trade, your lineup for New Orleans is looking like Derrick Rose, Drew Holiday, Andrew Wiggins, Taj Gibson, and Julius Randle, with Mirotic and Etuan Moore coming off the bench, which is a pretty solid team. And then for Minnesota, your starting lineup is going to look like Jeff Teague, probably Josh Okogie, Robert Covington, Anthony Davis, and Karl Anthony Towns, with Gorgui Dieng and like Dario Saric as your main guys off the bench. So I think it's a pretty fair trade, especially when you throw in 2 first-round picks going to New Orleans. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about this trade. I think it's pretty even when you consider 2 first-round picks as well. The only thing for New Orleans is they'd have to be in the mode to be a contender, because Wiggins' contract is so long that you wouldn't really take it on unless you're trying to still compete for the playoffs. Next trade on here, I have AD going to the Spurs, and he's the only player I have going over there. And then to the Pelicans, I have Pau Gasol, Davis Bertans, Bryn Forbes, and Derek White, along with 2 future first-round picks. Actually, honestly, it might require 3 for this one. Really, for New Orleans, this is another like we're gonna bust it up and rebuild trade. What do they get though? They get Pau Gasol, who's just basically salary cap filler. But between Forbes, Bertans, and White, you get like a lot of really promising young guys that you can see build. And I look at this sort of as like what Philadelphia was trying to do when they acquired guys like Jeremy Grant and Robert Covington and guys like that. Like they're kind of taking nothing and hoping that they make them into something. You know, all these guys have actually done pretty decent for the Spurs and getting decent rotational minutes. Davis Bertans is shooting like something like 45 or 46% from 3, which is really impressive. But again, I think the Pelicans would definitely require those first-round picks. I think 3 of them to make this deal happen. But I think it's pretty even for the Spurs that aren't really looking to rebuild. They're looking to contend, so draft picks aren't super valuable. That being said, their starting lineup after this would look something like Patty Mills, DeRozan, Rudy Gay, Anthony Davis, and LaMarcus Aldridge, with like Bellinelli as your main guy off the bench. So a really solid starting 5, probably one of the best in the league, honestly. And they probably catapult up the standings a little bit with this trade, I would say. Next trade I have on here is between the New Orleans Pelicans and the Indiana Pacers. I have the Pacers receiving Anthony Davis and the Pelicans receiving Miles Turner, Domantas Sabonis, Thaddeus Young, and Aaron Holiday. So what do the Pelicans get out of this? They get an expiring $14 million in Thad Young that they can get that money back in the offseason. And then you get Miles Turner making $3 million, Domantas Sabonis making 2.6, and then Aaron Holiday making 2. So a lot of really young guys on cheap contracts. Yes, Miles Turner is a free agent, but I think they would still have the restricted free agent rights to him, so you could re-sign him for no matter what, basically. You get a really solid front court in those two, and then Aaron Holiday's a really young guy who uh, he could play with his brother Drew Holiday, and although he is pretty rough around the edges right now, he still has actually been pretty good in the limited minutes he's gotten. Um, and so maybe like if Elfrid Payton walks in free agency, you can still have Aaron Holiday as your starting point guard next to Drew Holiday. But you get this really promising guy in Sabonis. That's probably the main prize out of this thing, who's only making $2.6 million, but he could arguably be a number one on a team. This is sort of an awkward trade in that you might have to throw in a first round pick as well. Probably one first round pick, I'd say, because although New Orleans is getting some good pieces back, it's not like this team with these guys would be like an instant playoff contender with a starting lineup that would probably look like Aaron Holiday, Drew Holiday, E'Twaun Moore, Sabonis, and Miles Turner with like Nikola Mirotic and Julius Randle off the bench. It'd be a really crowded front court. You'd actually probably have to play Mirotic quite a bit at the 3 spot, just so you don't have two guys backing up your two starters, which I feel like there's just going to be limited minutes. That being, oh, actually, you know, your starting lineup after this would probably look like not E'Twaun Moore at the 3, but probably Thad Young playing the small forward, because he can play small forward as well. For Indiana, it's kind of a confusing trade in that Victor Oladipo just went down, so you would figure that they wouldn't trade for Anthony Davis to make a playoff push, but I think it's kind of like a now or never thing where if they acquire him, they could have this great team next year, but if they don't, they won't have a ton next year, I don't think. They still would have Sabonis and Turner, but I feel like Anthony Davis is $1 and Sabonis and Turner are two 50-cent pieces, and so I'd rather have the dollar than two 50-cent pieces myself. So that being said, I'll take Anthony Davis over those two. But you know, next year they'd be in a great spot to be like the 1 or the 2 seed in the East. I'd say your starting lineup would look like probably Collison, Oladipo, Bogdanovich, Anthony Davis, and at center, they'd probably have to go out and sign somebody because Kyle O'Quinn's going to be a free agent after this year. Actually, Bogdanovich, Tyreek Evans, Collison, Kyle O'Quinn, all going to be free agents after this year. So their lineup could be subject to some oddities. This is actually probably my least favorite trade out of all of them, just because I think it's the least likely to happen. Next trade I have on here is one where New Orleans would sort of be trying to rebuild, but also have the option to not rebuild if they wanted to. I'll explain that here in a sec. So I have them trading with Milwaukee. I have Milwaukee acquiring Drew Holiday and Anthony Davis. I have New Orleans acquiring Malcolm Brogdon for $1.5 million, Eric Bledsoe for $15 million, Chris Middleton for $13 million, and then Tony Snell and Ilyasova to make the salaries match. So New Orleans gets a lot of good depth here, which they've kind of been lacking this season and the past couple of seasons. And what do they get in return? They get off of the contract of Drew Holiday, which is pretty big for him, for what he's worth, I'd say, making $26 million over the next 4 years. Okay, so now for New Orleans, you can either re-sign Bledsoe in the offseason or let him go if you think he's going to demand too steep of a price. You get a borderline all-star in Chris Middleton, and you get Malcolm Brogdon, who's averaging this year as a shooting guard, 16 points on 52% shooting, and I think 44% shooting from 3, which is outstanding efficiency for a shooting guard, scoring 16 points a night. Then you get solid role players in Ilyasova and Tony Snell. Starting lineup for New Orleans after this trade likely looks like Bledsoe, Brogdon, Middleton, Mirotic, and Julius Randle with E'Twaun Moore, Tony Snell, and Ilyasova off the bench. For New Orleans, for Milwaukee, the incentive is pretty strong. You get two guys that are really useful on a playoff contender type of team. You also Milwaukee might have to throw a first round pick New Orleans' way to make this deal happen. But then for Milwaukee, your starting lineup is going to probably look like George Hill, Drew Holiday, uh, Giannis, Davis, and then Brook Lopez. And then off the bench, you really don't have much depth at all. You have like Jason Smith, Dante DiVincenzo, and Pat Connaughton as your basically your main guys, and Thon Maker too. So depth is lacking, but you could arguably say you have the two best players in the game on your team, or the second and third best players, however you want to say it, two top five players. But Anthony Davis and Giannis would be a pretty powerful combination, I would say. Next, I have New Orleans and Philadelphia trading. For this trade, it's first round pick to New Orleans along with Markelle Fultz and Jimmy Butler in exchange for Anthony Davis. So now this is a trade for New Orleans where they can continue to contend. They get a first round pick, they get a project in Markelle Fultz, who could be a lot better if he changes scenery and gets a fresh start. And you get Jimmy Butler, who is an all-star in his prime, who would, I think, re-sign with you if you offer him the money. Starting lineup for New Orleans after this, I would say you're probably going to actually start Markelle Fultz, I think, just to give him some confidence. Then Drew Holiday, Jimmy Butler at the 3, Mirotic at the 4, Julius Randle at the 5, with Ejuan Moore and Elfrid Payton as your main guys off the bench. For Philadelphia, you get a great player right in his prime in Anthony Davis. Your starting lineup after this probably looks like Ben Simmons at the 1, JJ Redick at the 2, Wilson Chandler at the 3, Anthony Davis at the 4, and Joel Embiid, of course, at the 5. And then if they do this trade, I would say they're like right there, like possibly equal to like a Milwaukee or Toronto. But of course, it's remains to be seen how the team would work as far as chemistry and stuff like that. Next trade I have on here is an interesting one. It's between Houston and New Orleans, and it would be a reunion of sorts for New Orleans. Well, first I'll start with what Houston gets. It's kind of a more obvious package. They get Anthony Davis, Mirotic, and Solomon Hill. Mirotic and Solomon Hill are more like salary cap throw-ins, both expiring contracts after this season, which add up to $24 million. But for New Orleans, you get two guys, well, arguably in their primes. They get Chris Paul and Clint Capella, and the salaries match up perfectly in this trade. What do you get if you're New Orleans? You get basically the second and third best players in this trade, but you give up the first best player. So really what they're getting is just a little bit more depth in exchange for Anthony Davis. But your starting lineup for New Orleans after this looks like Chris Paul, Drew Holiday, then probably Ejuan Moore at the 3, Julius Randle at the 4, and then Clint Capella at the 5, with Elfrid Payton coming off the bench and Darius Miller coming off the bench. So they get a little bit better in their starting lineup, I'd say, in that you don't have to. I think that probably Clint Capella is more valuable than Mirotic, but I don't know. It's a decent trade, but I think that personally that Houston would have to throw in 2 to 3 first round picks to make this happen. Probably 2, I'd say. And then you also get the Chris Paul New Orleans reunion, which would be pretty cool. And you get the established point guard to play alongside Drew Holiday, so he can permanently play this shooting guard, which they've been trying to transition him to over the last season or two. But they haven't really had like an established point guard who can play big minutes, who can play next to Holiday. Like they had Rondo last year, but Rondo was only playing like 25 to 30 minutes a night. Whereas I think Chris Paul, you can slate him in every night for like at least 30 minutes if he were on New Orleans. And then Clint Capella is a pretty solid rim protector and rim runner, who Chris Paul's familiar with and can throw lobs to with ease pretty much. And then I think he would do the same with Julius Randle actually too, who's a little bit of a more versatile scorer, but he can do everything that Capella can do on offense. As for Houston, you get Ryan Anderson 2.0 and Nikola Mirotic, and then you get Anthony Davis, who's obviously the big prize of this trade. You give up some of your playmaking ability in Chris Paul and some of your defensive protection around the rim in Clint Capella, but I'd argue Anthony Davis can match his Capella's defensive abilities while being much better on offense. and then you get well, arguably a guy who's as good, if not better, than James Harden, and really Solomon Hill is just a salary cap thrown, so I'm not going to talk about him. But you get some more spacing in Mirotic, which you've been desperately needing. So your starting lineup after this probably looks like, I'd say, James Harden at the 1, um, and then you have likely, I'm going to say at the 2, Eric Gordon probably, or Austin Rivers if they start him instead. Um, and then small forward, probably PJ Tucker, power forward, Mirotic, and then center, Anthony Davis. You could also do something where you bring Mirotic off the bench and you start um, Nene even at the 5 and put AD at the 4, or you could start Gerald Green at the 3, put Tucker at the 4, and keep AD at the 5. So you've got options. Um, but I like a death lineup sort of something like James Harden, Eric Gordon, PJ Tucker, Mirotic, and Anthony Davis. And then the last trade I have on here is between the Pelicans and the Raptors. I have Toronto getting Anthony Davis, Wes Johnson, Etuan Moore, and Solomon Hill. And then I have the Pelicans getting Kyle Lowry, Jonas Valanciunas, and Pascal Siakam. So for New Orleans, they're definitely with doing this trade, they would say that we want to remain a contender, and you get a starting lineup after this of Kyle Lowry, the established point guard who can play next to Drew Holiday and relieve him of his point guard duties. So you get starting lineup of sorry, excuse me, I kind of interrupted myself. Kyle Lowry, Drew Holiday, probably then Pascal Siakam or Mirotic just starting at the 3, honestly, because they're gonna have to go big to fit all these guys. Julius Randle at the 4, and probably Valanciunas at the 5, with either one between Pascal and Nikola Mirotic coming off the bench. Probably Mirotic coming off the bench, I'd say, with Pascal slotting in at the small forward spot. And then off the bench, you have which either guy you didn't start, along with Alfred Payton and Darius Miller. For Toronto, your rotation after this is going to look something like Fred VanVleet starting at the 1, Danny Green at the 2, then you have Kawhi at the 3, AD at the 4, and then Serge Ibaka at the 5. With off the bench, you have DeLon Wright, OG Anunoby, and Etuan Moore as your main bench guys. And then you're going to have to play Greg Monroe a little bit more as your backup center because you kind of give up your backup big with Jonas Valanciunas. This one I see is pretty mutually beneficial for each team. You get a lot more depth if you're New Orleans, and you still get an all-star back in Kyle Lowry, along with Pascal Siakam, who's playing great. Could be most improved player this year, but he's only making $1.5 million, which is really good value for what he's giving you. And then Valanciunas, who's like a quality center in the NBA. He can start or come off the bench. I see him starting for New Orleans. So yeah, I see this trade pretty even. Yeah, I like it for both teams a lot. That's really all I can say about it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting and informative. And I'd love to hear in the comments below what you guys think Anthony Davis should do or where he should go, or if you agree or disagree with any of my trades. Again, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.